Okay, so we're going to do 7:30 to 8 on the continuation of Gittin, and then at 8 o'clock we will
shift into Purim.
We'll shift in for a little while to Purim. Okay, great. Okay, so we were discussing the status of a ksav yad, just to bring us back to where we were. So again, a get is a divorce contract, and it's a shtar, and typically it is signed by witnesses, edei chasima, or if not, it's handed over in the presence of witnesses. Even in terms of the shtar, the contract part, edei mesira karsi or edei chasima karsi, according to the Rambam, as we've discussed, there's actually a choice. You could either go the route of a contract with edei chasima or edei mesira. However, the Mishnah on Pei Vav Amud Aleph, which we've been discussing, says Gimel Gittin Psulim, V'hanises, Havlad Kosher, which means that there are three substandard Gittin. They are substandard in the sense that we prefer that they not be utilized because they're not, operating according to the highest requirements. But in the end of the day, Minat Torah, biblically, they are sufficient. And therefore, if there's a remarriage on the basis of that get, then the child will be unblemished, will not have the status of mamzer. Baruch Hashem. So the first of those is Kosa Biksav Yado Ve'ein Alav Edim, which is an interesting case. It's the autograph, pretty much, of the Baal. The Baal, instead of having a get and having it signed by two witnesses or delivered in the presence of two witnesses, he writes out in his own handwriting, or maybe somebody else wrote the text, but he signs it. And as such, the Kosa Biksav Yado, according to the Mishnah, B'diavad is a proper get Minat Torah. We prefer it not be used, but if it is used, it is effective. It accomplishes gerushin, and the second marriage would be a valid marriage, and the children produced in that marriage would be, kosher Jews. They wouldn't have any issues of mamzerus, etc. Okay, so that's the Mishnah on Pei Vav Amud Aleph. However, what we noted was that the ksav yad structurally is something in between, a verbal commitment and a contract. And that's why when it comes to Dinei Mamonos, for example, in the Sugya and Bav Basra, it has some properties of a milva b'shtar and some properties of a milva al peh. For example, everybody admits that if you take out a loan and it is supported not by a regular contract with witnesses, but by a ksav yad, that you can't be govim in chasim mishabad. That's a Mishnah. You can't, collect from the creditor from liened property, from property that was his, as a liquid asset at the time of the loan, but which he subsequently sold to a buyer, some third-party buyer. If it was a milva b'shtar, you'd be able to grab that property, meaning the creditor would grab the property from the lokeach, from the purchaser, since at the time of the transaction, it was a liquid asset of the debtor. But if we're dealing with a ksav yad and not with a shtar, then there's no kaviyah min chasa mishubad. And there's a debate among the Rishonim, what about the other main facet of a loan on contract, namely the principle of shtarcha biyadi my boy. Typically, if the debtor claims that he paid the creditor, meaning the lova said, I paid you already, I paid you yesterday. Typically, if it was a milva al peh, if it was a verbal loan, then even if it had adim, even if there were actual witnesses there, but there's no contract. So if later on, subsequently, the there was a dispute whether the loan was repaid or not, we'd say, go for a call.
I don't have the check.
You don't have it.
No, no, I don't have it. I'm not prepared.
However, if we are dealing with the middle of the shore,
Because Bobby is on the
the
phone.
rule that applies
What?
is
Rabbi
Roth, you're not on
Yes.
mute. You're
Sorry.
not on mute. You're not on mute. You're not on mute. Just so you know, okay?
I'm not on view,
You're not on mute. We can hear you. You're not on mute.
but I see myself on the
I'm talking about your voice. We can hear you and your wife. We can hear you. You're not on mute. That's what I was saying. Okay, go ahead.
we're always happy to hear your questions. And comments. Anyway, Shtarcha B'yoni, my boy, will not apply. The idea that, the outstanding evidence is like a smoking gun, that is a debate among the Rishonim. So the point I'm trying to make is that Ksav is somewhere in between a verbal transaction and a written contract. So the question that comes, and that's what I want to discuss right now,
Well, why doesn't
is what about Kiddushin? What's that?
Why doesn't Hodos Baldim Kamei Adam come in picture here?
So it might. When Rashi was trying to explain why Ksav Yad works Minat Torah for Gittin, he gives basically 3 explanations. His first one is, if you hold like Ramera, it won't work. That's not an explanation, that's a statement. The second one is Hodas Baldim Kamei Dami, or more precisely, Ksav Yado Shel Habailim Harehu Kemea Edim. That's the language that he uses. But his third pshat, this is the important one, is that it's a special Xeris HaKasuv because the Torah says the Kasav La Sefer Krisus V'Nasam Biyada. So literally, the Kasav refers to Ksav Yad. The Kasav Ksav Yad V'Nasam.
But
So now the question is,
are we saying that the Mea Adam still is not as strong as the concept of Rish Lakish on the star?
correct, because it's an interesting question, because on the one hand, why do I need evidence if I'm experiencing the event, right? And in a certain sense, if you have somebody's Ksav Yad, so it's as if they're with you. It's not, it's stronger than 2 witnesses telling you what their intention was. They're writing what their intention was. So once you authenticate the document, it's like you have a living, testimony.
But it doesn't have the bulletproof effect.
But exactly.
Which applies to the star.
Exactly. But even if it's a better indication of what the will of the Bailim was at the time, it's not a blank check of Eidos, which is what Reish Lakish is over time. And therefore, it stands somewhere in between. And therefore, according to the third view of Rashi, if not for the Xeris HaKasuv of the Kasav LaSefer Krisus V'Nasan Biyada, it certainly would not work. So now the question is, good, the status in Gittin is a little bit cloudy, and that's why it's Pasal Midrabanan, even though it's Kasher Midoraisa. It might be like Mea Edim, it might be worse, it might be better. When it comes to Dine Maminis, what's the status of Ksav Yad? Also very confusing, right? It definitely, is effective. How effective? Not for Shibudim, for sure, and very controversial. What about Shtarcha B'yadi, my boy? So now the question is, what about Kiddushin? Because Kiddushin, on the one hand, has the standards of Gittin, and even the Hekesh of Gittin, V'yatzav V'haisa.
But also,
On the other hand, it doesn't have the Xeris HaKasuv of the Kasav La Sefer Krisus V'Nasan Biyada that is explicit. And in addition to that, and this will be very important, every time you have the Hekesh of Havaya Liyitzia, you have to weigh 2 things. On the one hand, there's a parallel between getting married and getting divorced. They're both, they're mirror images of each other. And that's a good reason for them to have, in some respects, the same standards. However, equally, it's a good reason in some cases for us not to compare them, because even though they're parallel opposites, and some issues have to do with the difference between what we call la'ayule and la'fuke, meaning, for example, the Gemara says in Kiddushin, Daf Hey Amud Aleph, as a kind of reductio ad absurdum. Meaning the Gemara doesn't mean it as a serious, suggestion, but it's like a minchas chinuch question. The Gemara is saying like, what's wrong with this idea? The Gemara says, well, kesef is machnis. You get married with a tabas, with a ring, kiddushay kesef, right? So maybe kesef should be motzi because of the yotzav haisa, right? And then the Gemara says, no. That's, it doesn't make any sense. You're not going to give her money, giving her money as a present, to integrate her into your life. You say harat mukadeshusly and you give a tabas. That's very different, than giving money on when you give somebody money on the entrance, it's like a gift or shared experience. You give it to on the exit, it's compensation.
But the whole idea of comparison is really counter logical, because the fact that each one of these kedushin and gittin have their own psukim and their own rules is the Torah telling you that you can't compare. Otherwise,
But remember that the whole.
No, they have their own rules set specifically with the clear differentiations. All right.
Not so clear. Because as I say,
the fact that there are differentiations is clear. What the differentiations may be.
Right. So that's what's true. Remember that the whole shtar kiddushin comes from the yotzav haisa. According to the Gemara, there would be no kiddushay shtar if it wasn't for gittin.
Yeah,
on the other hand, it's ayule and afuke.
One requires the consent of the woman, one doesn't. One is
right. Okay, so we're going to get to that in a minute. We'll get to that in a minute. But that's exactly the point I'm trying to make. It's what we would like to say, it's dialectical, meaning there are two sides in this discussion. On the one hand, it makes sense that it's all Eben Ha'ezer. It's all about a transcendent bond, either that you're creating or that you're breaking, and therefore the standards might be very, in terms of the how demanding the standards are, how rigorous they are, might be very similar, because in both cases you're doing something which is monumental and consequential, creating the bond or changing that bond. In that respect,
are we ignoring the mammon issue?
No, one second. In that respect, V'yatzav Haisa is a very consequential hekesh, and is the source for many. I'll give you another example. The Gemara discusses, I say all Kiddushei Shtar comes from that. Earlier in the year, we mentioned that there's a psul mechubar, right? Which means that if you write a get on a tree, or a leaf that's attached to the ground, that's not acceptable, because it says the kasav, law sefer krisis for nasan, mi she'eno mechusar, davar, dahainu, ksiva ketzitza, right? Umasira, unasina. Is there a psul mechubar on Kiddushei Kesef or even Kiddushei Shtar? So that's a massive argument among the Rishonim. Some of them say, yeah, the standards are the same, V'yatzav Haisa. And others say you can't compare the incoming and the outgoing, right? And we'll see why going forward. Or another example, this in the Gemara. That's a machlokas Rishonim. I'll give you a machlokas in the Gemara. The Gemara in Kiddushin Daf Tes Amud Aleph, which is going to be relevant to our discussions going forward, discusses, do you need lishma in a shtar Kiddushin? I mean, lishma means purity of mode, meaning if there are two people with the same name, right, as we discussed, two Yosef ben Shimon's or two, Sarah bas Leah's, you can't just write a get, with a generic name, or the get for one is not going to work for the other. There's a personalization, when it comes to gittin, a lishma. The get has to be created for these particular individuals. Now, shtar kiddushin is learned out from the yotzav haisa. Does it need to be lishma? So this is a machlokas in the Gemara in Kiddushin, Daf Tes Amud Aleph. Ultimately, the Gemara rules, and the Rambam and others paskin, that you do need lishma in shtar. But before the Gemara came to that conclusion, the Gemara said, listen, why should we compare gittin to kiddushin? Isn't it better to compare kiddushin, Kiddushei Shtar to Kiddushei Kesef? Better to be makish havayos lahadadi than to be makish, right, havaya liyatzia. Now, is there logic in that? Sure. And we'll see that there are some differences between lishma of kiddushin and gerushin, even though lamaskana, because of yatzav haisa, we learn from the other. So what are we seeing in all this? What we're seeing is that the connection between yatzav haisa sometimes wins the day, right? Like in the institution of Kiddushei Shtar, in the lishma of Kiddushei Shtar, according to some in the psul mechubar of Kiddushei Shtar. But at other times, no one's going to say that gerushin can be bekesef or bebia. That's the Gemara in Kiddushin Hayom and Aleph. The Gemara says you're not going to say that. Of course, you're not going to say it. And some people dispute mechubar and some people dispute lishma. But we can understand both of them because on the one hand, as I said, if we're talking about the severity or the broader nature of institutions of ishus, that's a common denominator. But if we're talking about things that have very specifically to do with, creating the simcha and the, creation of a bond of Baal Ki'ishto, in one direction, or the, dismantling of all of that, and, the davar hakoris beino lebeino, where basically they can have no impact on each other at all going forward. That's exactly the opposite. So you have this thing. So now the question is, what about Ksav Yodo? So I'm going to show you in a minute is that that is a debate. So again, let me say it this way. If you take the view that, the reason Ksav Yad works in a get is because it's Kamea Edim, then on the surface, one would think that would be fine for Kiddushin too. If Ksav Yad is a regular star in Dinim Amanis and in Gittin, then, why wouldn't it be a regular star for Kiddushin? It's like if Eile Chasima work, we're saying, if we're going to say Ein Lecha Chasima Gedola Mizu, then we're going to say Ein Lecha Chasima Gedola Mizu in Kiddushin, assuming that Kiddushin work Be'edei Chasima, which is, I'll show you soon, is for the Rambam is not such a simple matter. Believe that. Let's leave the Rambam out of it for just a minute. Hopefully we'll get
the question that I'm struggling with, so the foundational question, and that is that almost everything has similarities in the foundation, but differences that are clearly itemized. So right. Just because it has some foundational similarity.
No, so in each case you have to judge what is, what is the main, is it about the standards and the rigor, or is it about the direction that all this is?
Well, when the Torah goes out of its way, not to just put the foundation down and say, okay, now you can compare, but goes out of its way to show specific ways in which Kiddushin works and specific ways in which Gittin works. So
right, but it also,
we should almost take it like it will be an indisputable set of rules, and we have to simply follow the rules as they're written.
Right, but I think you're downplaying.
Similarity in the foundation doesn't mean that we can go and compare.
No, of course. That's why it's dialectical. That's why there are two sides. But you're downplaying too much the hekesh of Yatzav Haisa. Remember that in Parshas Kiteitzei, this is what we began the year with. The Torah only speaks about Kiddushin in the context of Gerushin. Right? It's a background. That's what's so remarkable. What we were trying to explain in the beginning of the year is if you understand Gerushin really well, then you have a greater appreciation of what Kiddushin is.
Well, then you can turn the argument around and say, if that's the case, then how could there be any differences between Kiddushin?
Right, but there have to be differences because the direction. You're not going to say, oh, you have a Shivas Yemei Hagerushin, or a Sudas Gerushin.
Yeah, you're not exactly. You're not going to have dancing at the divorce.
So obviously, when I use the expression that something is a parallel opposite, I'm referring to this dialectic. What I'm saying is there are parallels here. The relationship between Kiddushin and Gerushin is closer than any other two institutions because they are the mirror images of each other. But it's also the most distant and different because they're parallels, but they're opposites. So now the question is, what about Ksav Yad? So if the idea behind Ksav Yad is that it's Kamea Edim, why wouldn't that work in Kiddushin, all things being equal? However, becomes, one second, it becomes a bigger question according to the other view of Rashi, which is that it's Xeris HaKasuv, because the Torah says, V'kasuv l'sefer krisis v'nasan biyada. So does the Xeris HaKasuv said by get, V'kasuv v'nasan, does that apply to Kiddushin? So if you look at our Marmakomos, right, that is an argument between the Rashba and the Ritva. The Rashba and the Ritva argue on this point. Look, if you look on page, I think it's page 6.
Do we take a position as to whether it's harder to create or harder to destroy?
No, because there's mixed evidence on it. Meaning it's harder to create, but it's more, there's greater risk involved in not having high standards when you destroy, because you're being materes asish l'shuk. So the difficulty in creating the chalos is greater in Kiddushin, but the need for greater caution and care,
Consequences greater in
consequences are greater in Gittin.
Mhm.
Again, so it's complicated. Now, if you look at, if you look at the Ritva on page, I believe it's 6 or 7 or 5, this should be Chidusha Ritva Masechet Yevamos Lamed Aleph Amud Beis. What we find, excellent, perfect. Thank you so much. This piece here, Chidusha Ritva, I'm just going to read it very quickly. Avol nechleku bazer rabosai. There is an argument among the Rishonim, my teachers, says the Ritva, between on the question whether a ksav yad would work in Kiddushin. Yesh omrim, some say, she'ein psulin shavin, shavet, that, they're not the same. The gabi Kiddushin psulim min haTorah l'chol davar, she'ein davar shebe'erva pachos mishnayim, the gabi gerushin hu mishum d'chsiv v'kasav la, the ein lemedim hemenu l'Kiddushin, the shiny Kiddushin, the mechayev lachrini. So the first view is the view that says, don't compare Gerushin and Kiddushin. Kiddushin, right, is about being Oser. Gerushin is about being Matir. And those are very different things. And just because Ksav Yad works, to be Matir doesn't mean it'll work to be Oser. So therefore, and since the Xeris HaKasuv is the Kasav La Sefer Krisis, it's in the context of Gittin. So, we're not going to extend it any further. That is the view of the Rashba, but the Ritva doesn't like it. B.A. Shomrin, he says how some people say, given the Begerish and Nami Boishnayim, since even though there are differences, but get also requires Ede Kiyum, the Davar Shebe Ervahu, the Hasam Ksiva Xereshava, and there we have a limud, V'kasav V'nasan, that says Ksav Yad is good enough. Right? Ach sherachmana ksav yado hainu mishum deksivas yado chashuva ke'edim lemeved masa kishtar. That teaches us that, when it comes to matters of ishus, we consider ksav yad to be the equivalent of a contract. The afilu begerushin to be in krisus ulahakel kol shkein bekidushin shabalas or lahachmer. This is a response to exactly what you asked me a minute ago. Right? The Ritva says if it's going to work in gerushin, even though it's riskier to allow it because we're being matir eishes ish l'shuk, then certainly in Kiddushin, where we're being machmir, it should work. The flaw of that argument is...
only works if there's nothing on the other side.
Say that again?
Kal v'chol only works when you don't have something that's more severe.
Right.
We have things in Kiddushin that are more severe. So
Right.
Kal
Right.
v'chol wouldn't work.
So now you can understand why the Rashba doesn't think it's such a good Kal V'chomer.
This is one tough student the Rashba had.
Yeah. The lace on the Mekosh Baha, the Ma'idechai B'lachri, V'teida, he says, Doha Iska Shavaya Liyitzia, L'inen Kiddushei Shtar. He's saying, don't underestimate the relationship between them, because the whole institution of Kiddushei Shtar is only derived from Gittin. So he's saying, then take it lock, stock, and barrel. The Kiva de Kenya, Fina Lagamri. Hilka Ksav Yad, Kasab Ksav Yado, Kasher Min HaTorah, Upasul Midrabanan, and then it skipped 2 lines. He says, V'zehu emes lefidaiti, v'chein das maran, hamuvak, right? Aramu betosis helo adavar begimgo. So you have this maklokas. What I want to try to show I'm interested in trying to show for a minute, and we're going to switch over to Purim in like 2 more minutes, I believe, is the position of the Rambam.
He doesn't take into
Rambam in-
consideration that there are other ways than shtar to make Kedushin?
Say that one more time. Okay, great. That's what I want to show. So what's fascinating is the Rambam has one halacha. Look in Hilchos Ishus Paragimel Halacha Gimel. That would be on. One second.
Yeah, it's on the screen right now.
Oh, great, perfect.
Yeah.
So look at Parak Gimel Halacha Gimel, and thank you again. We're getting good at this, you know. The Rambam's in Parak Gimel Halacha Gimel, the Rambam says the following. You know, im kidesh b'shtar, if you undertake a kiddushin with a shtar, kosev ala niyar al acheres, you can write on even something that is not tamper-proof. This is very important. O al ha'ala, or on a leaf. Al kol davar sheyirtza haret mukudeshesli, haret muresesli, v'chol kiyotze b'dvar melu, v'nosno lo b'fnei edim. This is the Rambam's description of Kiddushei Shtar. What's striking about it? 2 things are missing. One is Ksav Yad, which he has in Gerushin, which he doesn't have in Kiddushin.
Mechuba.
But the other one, well, Mechubar he doesn't mention, but that's not, okay, that's an interesting point. But more blatant, more striking in its absence is the type of shtar. So one is Ksav Yad. You know what else is missing? Eidei Chasima. In Hilchos Gerushin, the Rambam says you can do either Eidei Mesira or Eidei Chasima. The Rambam says, I prefer Eidei Mesira, but b'diavad you can get away with Eidei Chasima. How come in Hilchos Ishus, he only mentions Eidei Mesira, no Ksav Yad, and no Eidei Chasima? So the Mefarshim on the Rambam are very upset. And they provide 2 approaches. One approach is they say, listen, don't get too excited. So you have to read the Rambam. The Rambam knew V'yatzav Haisa. You have to read the Rambam in Hilchos Ishus in light of his more expansive view about Gerushin in Hilchos Gerushin. Divrei Rambam aniyim b'makom echad v'yashirim b'makom acher. That's what the Lechem Mishnah says, the Mishnah Malach says. The problem is twofold. Number one, the Rambam doesn't say Kamosha Avaer. He doesn't give you a reference. Number 2, the Rambam wrote Hilchos Ishus before he wrote Hilchos Gerushin. It's hard to say that if he, provides only one of 3 examples, that he's relying on you reading the book later on. Not like you already read it. So the Meiri in Kiddushin and the Marshal in Yam Shlomo and the Gaon of Vilna in his Parish on Even Oezer come to the conclusion that the Rambam actually distinguishes between Gittin and Kiddushin. That when it comes to Gittin, he thinks either Ksav Yad or Eidei Mesira or Eidei Chasima, any of those 3 is good enough. When it comes to Kiddushin, only Eidei Mesira are good enough. And now the question, of course, is why? So what I'm going to try to explain next week, I'm not going to do it now because we have to shift over, is that, or not next week, I guess in 2 weeks when we continue, is I'm going to try to explain. Remember, we spent so much time explaining the nature of Eidei Kiyum, and that there are 2 perspectives on Eidei Kiyum. One is that it's a solemnizing, validating presence, and the other that it's about verification and not taking a risk when there's so many stakes. What I'm going to try to show in our next year is that the Rambam thinks both of these concepts are correct, but he thinks that Eidei Kiyum is different in Kiddushin than it is in Gerushin. And I'm going to try to support that based on the language of the Rambam in Hilchos Gerushin and Hilchos Ishus. That's one point. The second point to think about is something that you mentioned before, and that is the factor of Bal Korcha in Gittin that doesn't exist in Kiddushin may be at play here in establishing the effectiveness of Eidei Chasima and Ksav Yad as opposed to the need for Eidei Mesira. So while we know it's an argument, the Rambam Shita, again, is more complicated. Instead of saying yes or no, he distinguishes between Gittin and Kiddushin, and that affects his whole understanding of the relationship of these processes. So we will continue, Mir Hashem, with that 2 weeks from now when we continue with our
And
regular.
he's the lone soldier on this point? I mean, yeah.
Say that again?
He's a lone voice on this point, or are there others that's...
Well, again, the Rajba already said that Ksav does not work in Kiddushin, but only in Gerushin. But as far as I know, no one else who thinks that Eidei Chasima, according to Rabbi Eliezer, work, no one else that I'm aware of says that they will not work sufficiently for Kiddushin, and that he's a lone soldier. But I'm going to try to show that there's certain, part of his presentation, I think, reinforces the distinction and also the reason for the distinction. Okay, so Jacob, are we ready to?
Yes.
Switch?
Yes.
On or not?
Ready.
Should we wait a second?
No, we don't wait.
We don't
We
wait.
reward people for being on time.
Okay.
People came special, so let's start.
Okay, great. So I don't have my Makomos for this because because we're not in person, it's a little more difficult. But you'll follow along the idea, and I won't make it too long since we're, piggybacking both of these shiurim. So in the Megillah, which we're going to read next week, the Megillah characterizes itself by using two different expressions, and I want to speak a little bit about the implication of those two expressions. In Perek Tes, Pasuk Chavav, towards the very end of the Megillah, after the events of the Megillah, the story of Achashverosh and Haman and Esther and Mordecai, have been concluded, and thankfully, B'hashkachas Hashem, with divine intervention, the Jewish people emerged, from the precipice of great danger. They emerged, victorious, and entered into a period of relative tranquility and a flourishing period. So Mordecai and Esther wanted to, establish the holiday and the Megillah in a permanent fashion, and they, worked very strongly to accomplish exactly that. And that's the, formulation of Purim in our time is really based on the psukim in the end of the 9th chapter of Megillah Esther, which include two different formulations about the Megillah itself. So in Pasuk Chavav in Perek Tes, Al Kain Karula Yamim Ha'ela Purim, for this, or as such, these days were characterized as days of Purim, Al Shem HaPur, based on the lottery or the lots. Al Kain, says the Pasuk, Al Kol Divrei Ha'igeres Hazos. With respect to this entire Igeres, the first time that the Megillah characterizes itself, it calls itself an Igeres, a letter, Mara'u al Kacha Umaigia Alehem, right? Providing the, attitudes towards the perspective on, what happened, in this event. Then if we keep, reading the psukim, so Kimu v'kiblo hayudim aleim v'alzaram al kol hanivim aleim v'lo yavor, and the response of the, Bnei Yisrael was to accept, lidore doros, in the name of their children and future generations, that they would be committed to this holiday and this Megillah. Lios osim es shnei hayamim ha'ela, taking these 2 days, kichsavamu kizmanam v'kol shana v'shana, right? Each and every year. V'hayamim ha'ela niskarim v'na'asim v'chol dar v'dar mishpacha mishpacha medina medina v'ir v'ir v'yimei ha'purim ha'ela lo yavru mitoch ha'yehudim. Will always be celebrating Purim v'zichram lo yasuf mizaram, and the memory of Purim is something that will never end, for Klal Yisrael and for their future progeny. Because of this pasuk, the Yerushalmi tells us that even if the other Sfarim in Nevi'im and Ksuvim, at some point will no longer attain the status of Kisvei HaKodesh. Chamisha Chumshei Torah, of course, always will have that status. And the one exception in all of Nevi'im and Ksuvim will be the book of Megillas Esther as well. Based on this pasuk, that's what the Rambam quotes. We'll get back to it in the end, that, V'imei HaPurim ha'ela lo yavru mitoch ha'Yehudim. Purim will never, be ignored. It'll always be part of the Jewish holidays. V'zichram, and the memory, lo yasuf mizara. Then finally, after that, the Megillah concludes, but Tichtov Esther Malka Bas Abichai Mordechai Yehudi Es Kol Tokef. They wrote all of this down in a formal document. Lekayem Es Igeres HaPurim Hazos Hasheni, in order to substantiate or reinforce or reaffirm the Igeret, the letter of Purim, once again. And then we're told, Vayishlach Sfarim al Kol HaYudim al Sheva v'Esrin u'mei Medina Malchus HaKasher Tivrei Shalom Be'emet L'kayem es Yimei HaPurim ha'elu b'zmanehem, and so on. And then we're told, Umamar Esther Kiyam Divrei HaPurim ha'elu v'nichtav ba'sefer. So we have four references, if you will, to the to the Megillah. The first two, and the ones that characterize and define what the Megillah really is, call it an Igeres, a letter. Igeres is not a category or a depiction, that we are so accustomed to in Tanakh writing or especially in halachic contexts. But in Perek Tes, Pasuk Chavav and Pasuk Kav Tes, right, the initial and the more characteristic description of Megillas Esther depicts it as an Igeres. On the other hand, Perek Tes and Pasuk Lamed, Vayishlach Sfarim El Kol HaYehudim Divrei Shalom Ve'emet, and V'nichtav Ba'sefer, use the more traditional term of a sefer, of a work, a document, a comprehensive work. Torah's a sefer, Ksov Zikaron Ba'sefer, where we speak about the upcoming, this Shabbos, of course, is Parsha Zachar, and the Kriya may be one of the only Kriyos, or the only Kriya, according to some, which is mandated Min Torah, right? So the Torah says, Torah said earlier in the end of Parshas B'Shalach that you should, record the memory of what Amalek did, B'Sefer. So the phrase B'Sefer is when we talk about a Sefer Torah, we speak about it as a Sefer. Right? We talk about Sifrei HaNevi'im and Ksuvim, we talk about it as a Sefer. So there's a certain interesting juxtaposition here. On the one hand, the characteristic description of the Megillah about itself is as an Igeres, and yet the final two references to it was that it was sent out. It was written as an Igeres, you might say, by Mordechai and Esther, and it was sent out and received as a Sefer. What's the significance of this, again, dialectic of the Megillah being both an Igeres and a Sefer? How much Igeres, how much Sefer? Well, what is the significance of these two categories? So the Gemara in Masechet Megillah, Daf Yud Tes Samad Aleph, addresses this question really only once. And, it provides important information. But what happened afterwards is very fascinating. Already in the Gaonic world, and then, subsequent to that, this discussion of what, is the significance of the terms Sefer and Igeres expanded considerably. So in the Gemara itself, in Megillah, one second, if you look at the Gemara in Megillah on Daf Yud Tes Amud Aleph, towards the bottom of the page, the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rab Chelbo, Amar Rav Chama Bar Guria, Amar Rav, Megillah Nikre Sefer. Megillah is called a Sefer. The Nikres Igeres. And it's also called an igeres, a letter, an epistle, if you want. Nikre Sefer, Shim Tafra B'chute Pishtan Sula. If you were to join together the pages of the Megillah, again, the Megillah is written on cloth, right? Like a Sefer Torah in that respect. And of course, again, like a Sefer Torah, it's made of different, urios. And then you have to integrate them together. And you do that by sewing, by linking them, together. But the Gemara tells us is that the fact that the Megillah is called a Sefer excludes the possibility of using just any material, like a pishtan, just regular string or anything like that, in order to integrate the leaves of the Megillah together. What you need is it has to be chute gidin. You have to use the gidin of an animal. So in that respect, the use of the term sefer mandates certain standards. But the Gemara says, on the other hand, it's v'nikre sigeres. It also uses the expression epistle, igeres. That's the teacher shem hitul ba shlosha chute gidin sheira. And then the Gemara adds, and this is some controversy, what it means, in a Sefer Torah, when you join together the urios, so you have to join them, across the entire, length of the cloth. When it comes to Megillah, I'll take one of the more popular approaches. There are you have to bind it together on the top, in the middle, and on the bottom, but you don't have to bind it together, every few, sections or stitches or lines all the way from the top to the bottom. As long as it's bound together, some people say 3 on the top, 3 in the middle, 3 on the bottom, with gidin, with the proper, material that implies like a formal. So you have a formal sefer binding together the urios, but we're much more flexible. We don't require that it be stitched together, in a way that highlights, like a tight connection. It's a looser connection, a bottom, a middle, and a top. Everybody with me so far? Hopefully?
Yes.
Okay, good. So the question is, this is, of course, food for thought. The Gemara is learning dinim from the double use, the different, depictions of the Megillah, whether it's a sefer or an igeres. What are we to make of this? Before we, examine this more fully, there's another puzzle in the same Gemara, or in the same Mishnah. The Mishnah on Daf Yud Tes Amud Aleph, when it talks about Kriyas HaMegillah, says something very interesting. It records an interesting argument. The Mishnah says that Umehechan Kore Adanas HaMegillah, how much or from what point in the Megillah is it necessary that the reading, include the Yotze Beidol Chavaso in order for you to fulfill your obligation? In other words, to make it clear, we paskin that the entire Megillah has to be read. However, there are Tanaim in the Mishnah that disagree. So Rameir Omer Kula, Rameir said the whole Megillah has to be read, otherwise you don't fulfill the mitzvah. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, Omer, Me'ish Yehudi, right, towards the beginning of the Megillah, there is, the beginning part of the Megillah is about the Su'uda and, the relationship of the Jewish people to the, to the kingdom, and then at a certain point, we introduce the personality of Mordechai with the words, Ish Yehudi Hayab B'Shushan Abira, right, Mordechai, Ben, and so on and so on. So according to one view in the Mishnah, the Baal Koreh, who's reading the Megillah, doesn't have to start from the beginning. He only has to start from the Jewish parts, from the introduction of Mordechai. Can you imagine that? Rabbi Yossi Omer, actually, Me'achar Hadvarim Ha'eleh. You only have to start reading at the introduction of Haman. Achar Advar Ma'ela, after the whole story of Achashverosh and Vashti, and even the beginning reference to Mordechai.
Are they arguing b'diavad or l'chachila?
At least b'diavad. It's not so clear because we're talking about mehechan korei adam v'samegila v'yotzei dechavas. So probably b'diavad, but even that is very fascinating. Now, to make it clear, we don't want to, cause any controversy in the Fifth Avenue Synagogue. We paskin, like the first man d'Amar, Rabbi Meir, that you have to read the entirety of the Megillah. But there are other views. Now, in the Gemara, when the Gemara asks and analyzes this, the Gemara says, Tan Rab Shimon ben Yochai, Omer, he had a different view. Mi balayla hahu. Memory, balayla hu, nadada, shnas hamelech. So there are at least 3 or 4 different views. How much of the Megillah, and at what point do you need to start the reading of the Megillah? So the Gemara says, Omer Rabbi Yochanan, the kulan mikra echad darshu. They're all trying to interpret one pasuk, but it says the pasuk says, "Vatichtov Esther Hamalka Basa Michael and Mordechai HaYehudi es kol tokef lekayim esigeres Purim Azos Hashinit." The same pasuk that I referred to before, where the Megillah, is defined or calls itself an igeres. So in that pasuk, it mentions Esther and Mordechai. And Kol Tokef, Samando Markula, Tokfo Shel Achashverosh. Kol Tokef means, even the Achashverosh part of the story, which is from the very beginning. Mandomar Me'ish Yehudi, Tokfo Shel Mordechai. Mandomar Me'achar Dvar Mo'ela, Tokfo Shel Haman. Mandomar Me'balayla Hahu, Tokfo Shel Nes. And then the Rav Huna says, no, they're actually darshaning the other part of the pasuk, Uma Ra'u Al Kacha, Uma Gia Alehem. Which, by the way, is the other pasuk. I don't think it's a coincidence that is characterized as an igeres. So the 2 psukim that are which define the Megillah as an igeres are food for thought to try to figure out that maybe you don't have to read the whole thing. You could start at a different point. However, the Gemara goes on to say that everybody agrees that no matter how much you have to read, all of the Megillah has to be written down. Amar Rab Chelba, Amar Rab Chama Bar Guria, Amar Rab, Halacha Kedivre HaOmer Kula. Number 1, we paskin that you have to read the whole Megillah. And number 2, Afilu Laman Amar Me'ish Yehudi, Sricha Shetehei Ksuva Kula. Even the Man Amar who says that you can get away with reading less, you have to have the full story in front of you, even if you're not reading the full story.
What does that mean in front of you? What does that mean in front of you? Like you have to have an open book? What does that mean?
Meaning the Megillah, there are 2 different issues. One is the hefts of the Megillah has to include the entire Megillah from the very beginning, right?
Well, today you can read from a chumash, I thought, if you're doing it by yourself.
Not if you want to be, to fulfill the mitzvah of Kriyas HaMegillah, you could follow in a chumash, but you should be hearing it from somebody who's reading.
If you're by yourself and you read the Megillah out of a chumash, you're not yotza?
You are not yotze the proper mitzvah, correct?
Really?
If you hear it from somebody who's reading it from a klaf, that's shomea ka'ona, then that's a absolutely correct way to fulfill the mitzvah. But the person who's reading it has to read it from a klaf. Again, if there is no klaf, it's still better to read it from a chumash than not read it at all. But it should be read publicly, and also, even if it's read privately, it should be read from a.
So all these mandamrim that are saying you don't have to read the whole thing, they're saying it has to be read. There's an echo from a klaf that has the entire story.
Correct.
So interesting.
And not only that. So the question is, why is that? Why does the whole story have to be there if we're only reading, parts of it?
Because, obviously, if they would win the day, then why would people waste printing a full Megillah? if they would be right,
Yeah.
then you wouldn't need to print an entire Megillah. I mean,
No, it's the
So-
opposite. That's what the Gemara is telling us. The Gemara is
yeah,
saying,
no. I'm saying, and that's why it's important, because they would say, well, what do I have to have the whole story for? I'll just
Correct.
have the story I need to read, and I won't waste the ink.
right. And remember, these things are very expensive. They
Right,
really-
they'll save money.
exactly. So what the Gemara is saying, Rav Chelbo is saying is, listen, number one, he's saying two things. Number one, you have to read the whole thing. Number two, he's saying, even according to the other views, the whole thing has to be written, even if it doesn't have to all be read. It has to be read from a document
Right,
From
that's
an
fully
era-
that has the whole story.
that has a whole story. So what I'm asking is, like, what is that? What kind of compromise is that? What's going on here? Oh, and is it a coincidence that these different views
Agree
all
on that.
flow from the psukim? You know, the two psukim. Is it a coincidence that characterize the Megillah as an example? The answer is
Someone has an echo.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Can everyone go on mute? Maybe.
What?
Maybe if everyone goes on mute, the echo will stop.
Unless people have questions, in which case
Which we love.
they can themselves, and we're always happy to hear questions. Okay, so this is, by the way, I'll just, it's an interesting phenomenon. The the Gemara also tells us something else that's very, very interesting, and that is that the Gemara says that if you are copying a Megillah, and let's say you want to read the Megillah as you're copying it, so you have to be copying it from a full Megillah for the same reason. In other words, if you were, you can't fulfill the mitzvah of Kriyas HaMegillah, by the Megillah that you're writing as you're writing it. Like, let's say you want to say,
So it has to be read from a fully executed Megillah. That's consistent with what we
correct.
just said.
So let's say you were trying to, let's say, for example, you were reading it as you were writing it, and in the end of the, in the end, let's say you write Vayhi, and you're,
So when you started
B'nei
it, it wasn't complete, but by the time you finish, it was complete. You're not Yotze.
and you're
Has to
reading
be-
it
has to be
as you're
started-
writing it, you're not
Right.
Yotze in that circumstance.
Okay.
So that is also interesting, because you could have thought that you need a perfectly executed Megillah, but if you get one by the time you've ended, that would be fine too. But it's
Yeah,
not.
but you
doesn't
say
work-
the brachas at the beginning, right?
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the Chefza Shel Megillah has to be intact from the beginning. Although it makes sense, but it's not because of the brachos. It's because of the mitzvah of Kriyas HaMegillah in its own right. And again, the question is why. There's an interesting puzzle that Turei Even, written by the author of the Shagas Aryeh, asked the question. The Gemara says in Megillah, you're not supposed to read the Megillah Baal Peh, right? You have to, which is why you have to read it from a cloth. If you read it from a Chodesh, that's the equivalent of reading it Baal Peh. But if there are some shibushim, we'll get back to this in a minute. If there are some mistakes in the Megillah, like let's say some of the words get rubbed out, or you skipped a few words. So the halacha is, as long as rove of the Megillah is kosher, and you're reading, rove from the Megillah, that's fine, b'di'eved as well. So the Turei Even asks the question, he says, why do you need both of these halachos? They seem like they cover the same ground, really. Meaning we're saying, if you're supposed to read from the inside the cloth of the Megillah, but if there's some words missing, then that's a different story. Or even if the words are there, right? If you just, you look away and you read one or two of them Baal Peh, as long as, mostly you're reading from the Klaf. Again, the Chatchila, you should read all of it from the Klaf. That would be good as well. He said, well, what do you need both of these things? It's the same thing.
What are you going to say, Luna?
But the Turei Even explains that based on what we just read, the position of Rabbi Kelbo, it doesn't have to be the same thing because there are two different issues. One is you have to read the majority of the Kriya has to be read inside the Megillah. There's another halacha, and that is that the majority of the Megillah, has to be, legible and readable.
Okay, so then
But if you don't paskin that you have to read the whole thing, let's say you only have to read from Ish Yehudi Hayab Shushan Habira, or Acharei Hadvar Ma'ela, which introduces Haman, or Balayla Hu Nadda Shnas HaMelech, right? If that were to be the case, then actually the majority or the rove of the Kriya would be a smaller amount than the rove of the Ksiva. Correct? Everybody with me? Because again, these are two different points. One is how much do you have to read, and the other is how much does the Megillah have to contain. The Megillah has, according to everybody, even if you can get away with reading less, the Megillah
has to be complete. Everyone gives a chefsa of what you read has to be complete.
Right. So even if it isn't complete, but at least it's rove, the rove of the Megillah is a bigger number than the rove of the Kriya, according to the Tanaim that say you don't have to read the whole thing. So really, that's why there are two different. That's what the Turei Even explains. He says that's why there are really two different dinim in the Gemara. It seems they're superfluous, but they're not. They're two different issues. One is what needs to be contained in the hefts of the Megillah that you're reading from. And everybody agrees that the standard there is the total story. The next question is, for the public reading, how much of that do you need to read? We paskin that it's the same. You have to read the whole story. But there were other Manda Amrim who felt, no, the Jewish part, or no, the beginning of the more obvious Hashgacha part, Balaylahu Nadda Shnas HaMelech, or the beginning of the danger, Vayhi Acharei Hadvar Ma'ela, which introduces Haman. Okay? But the question is why? Like, what's going on here? Why is there two different issues? What you have to read and what's written. Why does it need to be written in the Megillah if you're not reading it? If the point of the Megillah is simply to read the Megillah. Moreover, it makes sense, really. I mean, why the whole beginning of the story with Achashverosh and Vashti and how many days they partied and the Kalim, indeed, why wouldn't you just start with either the Jewish part or the threat part or the Hashgacha part? So these are all questions to ask.
Well,
I
don't understand that question. I mean, if it's a waste of time, then why print it all together? I mean, to me,
right. So no,
seems consistent.
So let's be clear. I'm asking why is this so important? Obviously, my conclusion is going to be that it's very important.
Right.
but I'm saying if it isn't, when you read it, it doesn't seem so germane. And that's
no, I'm saying, but working with it, right? But working with the question,
the fact
assuming
that there
the question
are
is
Tanaim,
correct, then why print it?
The fact that there are Tanaim who are telling you that you could start later, just strengthens the question, why print it? And why, in the end, if some people think it's good enough to start, at these other sections, why are we so insistent to read the whole thing?
All the Tanaim should explain why it's written. In other words, the Tanaim that feel
right. So what do they really think? That's what I'm going to try to explain. Before I do that, I want to just demonstrate for a few minutes, since my time is getting a little bit late. I want to demonstrate that this question of Igeres and Sefer, which the Gemara uses for one issue, right? The Gemara says it's dialectical. There are two aspects. You can't use any material to combine the pages of the Megillah. You have to use the same material that you use for a Sefer. That's why it's called a Sefer, Gidin. the Gidin are like, not just loose string or something like that, but the hard sinew of, an animal, the same level of chibur that you require in a sefer. At the same time, you don't have to have, running throughout the length of or the height of the page. You don't have to have connections between one page and the other. It's enough to have in the top and the middle in the end, because it's both an Igeris and a sefer. But what's interesting is that the Rishonim, or really the Gaonim, I should say, and then the Rishonim, expanded on the question of Igeris and sefer and wondered about a whole bunch of, separate individual issues. So let me discuss that, for a minute. So the Rambam, tells us several things. Rambam in Hilchos Megillah, Perek Beis, discusses all of these problems. And at one point, he tells us, he paskins this Gemara that I just read, HaMegillah tzricha tfira. The Megillah needs to be, sewed together. Ad shiyu kol orosecha Megillah achas, so that it's all one full Megillah. The Einan Tferes ala begidin k'sefer Torah. It needs to, use the material that you bind the Sefer Torah with. B'im tafra shelo begidin psula. The Einot tzarich litfaras kol hayiriya begidin k'sefer Torah, but you don't have to, connect it together all the way down like you do in a Sefer Torah. Elafilu tafar begidin gimel tfiros bekatzei ariya gimel beemtza gimel bekatzei hasheni kshera mipnei shenikra igeris. So basically, the Rambam faithfully quotes the Gemara that the use of sefer and igeris teaches us that you need a certain kind of, special material, but you don't need the full treatment of, combining it every inch, across. However, what's fascinating about the Rambam is that he also builds up the sefer part earlier, and then he builds up the igeris part later. So when it comes to earlier Perek Beis Halacha Tes, the Rambam says, "Ein kosfin es hamegillah ela b'dio." You have to use lasting, and very clear ink. Ala gvil or ala klaf. You need parchment of some sort. K'sefer Torah. Meaning, the reason that you have to use a certain quality of ink and surface is because it's a sefer Torah. It's like a sefer Torah because it's a sefer. B'im kasva, with other things, b'me'afza v'kalkantum kshera. And then he says, "Utzricha sirtut ketorah atzma." If you ever seen, everybody here, I'm sure, has seen the Sefer Torah. So there are lines, to that they're called sirtut. There are lines in the Sefer Torah that so that the top of the letter, is connected, to like an imprint in the a line in the Sefer Torah. That's called sirtut. So the Rambam says, based on the Gemara, that a Megillah also needs sirtut, ketorah atzma, like a Torah. On the other hand, eina or shala tzricha tzarech abada lishma. When it comes to Sefer Torah, you have to treat the parchment before you write on it. It has to be treated, ibud. It's called the in other words, the ore, the skin of the animal needs to be treated for the sake of being a Sefer Torah. You don't need to do that in a Megillah. However, the Hagos Maimonios quotes that some of the Gaonim said that the Rambam was too lenient. You do need ibud lishma. It's a sefer. It's just like a sefer. And they argue there's only one concession to a Megillah being an igeris, and that's the fact that you don't have to attach it all the way down. You can have an attachment that, is proportional, a little on the top, a little in the middle, a little in the end. As for everything else, say these Gaonim, Rav Tzemach Gaon and some others, it needs to be like a sefer. The ink, the parchment, ibud lishma, they go further. According to some of them, the Sefer Torah needs 48 lines. A Megillah needs 48 lines. A Sefer Torah, needs, Mukaf Gevil, when the letters of a Sefer Torah are written, they can't be touching each other. There has to be like a little bit of parchment in between the letters. The letters cannot be connected. It's called Mukav Gevil. Moreover, if you ever look at Sefer Torah, they have, ksarim. Certain letters have ziyunim. They have these, jots and tittles, crowns, I guess you'd call them. The Gemara tells a story in Masechet Menachos that, Rabbi Akiva was such a brilliant scholar, that he knew how to be dor. He knew how to pull halachos, out of the surah of the osios of the Sefer Torah, meaning the way, the form that was used to present, the Sefer Torah had meaning to Rabbi Akiva as a source of deriving, halachos. So do you need that? Do you need the Mukav Gevil? Do you need, ziyunim when it comes to a Megillah? So the Rambam omits it, presumably thinks you don't. Do you need dafka that it should be, the amount of lines, 48 lines, like a Sefer Torah? The answer is, according to the Rambam, no. But some Gaonim say it's a Sefer. There's only one concession to it being an Igeris, which makes that particular concession very interesting. On the other hand, make things a little shorter, the Rambam himself, after he quotes the Gemara about Igeris, adds something very fascinating. In Perak Beis, Halacha Yud Beis, the Rambam says, "V'tzorach hakore likros." Aseres b'nei Haman. That's fine. And then he adds, "Umina kol Yisrael shakore esamegila kore uposhet keigeres." So some people do this. I don't know what the practice is in the shul, but
It's done, Rabbi.
It is done. I mean, people, what they do is they open up the whole Megillah from beginning to end, and then they fold it a little bit to make it. You do that in the shul? Yeah,
Ezra does that.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. It's a common practice. It comes from Rav Hai Gaon originally, and the Rambam codifies it. So you stretch out. Why do you do that? Because of the expression Igeris. If it's like an Igeris, so we'll have to explain what that means. Poshet Kigeris laharos ukeshiyigmor. This is also important. When you when the Baal Koreh finishes reading the Megillah, chozer v'korcha kula umavarech. He doesn't make the bracha until he, winds it all the way back up to what it was. He doesn't leave it open.
He can have a shliach also. It doesn't have to be him directly.
Yeah, correct. But he shouldn't make the bracha until it's back. There's a story, that the Maharil in his shul, the person started saying the bracha after the Megillah before the Megillah was rolled up, and he was very very upset about it. He said, you have to wait, and he insisted that he repeat the bracha. So this is an interesting issue. The Hagos Maimonios quotes from Tzemach Gaon again, who disagreed with this practice. I mean, the practice of extending the Megillah. Amnam kasav Rav Tzemach Gaon, Koris Megillah Koreh v'Koreh Sefer Torah. He says, no, you don't do it that way. You just open up the parts that you're reading and you keep rolling it like a Sefer Torah. Why? Because it's called a Sefer. The Chein Minag B'Shtei Yeshivos. This was the minhag in the two, central yeshivot in Bavel. Ubebeis Rabbeinu shebeBavel, ubekol makomos Yisrael. V'chein Amar Rav Palti Gaon, Aval Rabbeinu Hai Gaon, I mentioned before, Kosav ki Rabbeinu HaMachaber. Rav Hai Gaon is the, I guess the earliest source for this minhag that the Rambam quotes. The Zelashono, Minhaga dechazi lana. Rav Hai Gaon says, I saw this minhag. Demand the Kari Megillah Koreh Poshta Ki Igeres. The person reading the Megillah, extends it as if it's an Igeres. Ukeshiyigmar, when he concludes, Chozer v'Karcha Kula, he puts it all the way back to the beginning. Umavarech. Avala Koreh v'Koreh Kesefer Torah Lo Chazilon. I never saw anybody, says Rav Hai Gaon, who reads a Megillah like a Sefer Torah, namely, that, he keeps, rolling it, to the next section, as we go forward through with it. V'chein kasav mishmo, v'chein nimsa bin minagenu, kasav b'shem Rabbeinu Meir, v'chein hinig maharam. So you have these very fascinating arguments about, how much sefer and how much igeres. But the question is, what are these factors, which we're going to get to in one more minute. I'll just give you two other examples very quickly. In the very beginning of Perek Beis Hilchos Megillah of the Rambam, so the Hagos Maimonios, again commenting on the Rambam, quotes another minhag of the Gaonim that was very controversial. It says the following: Noagu b'kriyas Megillah shelo lahafsik. There was a practice that the Balkore of the Megillah would not clearly end, his, or pause, I should say, at the end of the psukim. Right? Shelo lahafsik u'lahanshim klal.
Do you mean the end of the plucking?
No, psukim.
So how
each pasuk, each pasuk has a certain, like a sof pasuk, as part of the ta'amim, right? Like when we read Kriyas Torah, you can always tell the end of the pasuk.
Not quite, but I don't want to argue about it. But it's not quite. The only change in the ta'amim, specifically musically speaking, is that when we talk something like kelim shonim, that's from Beis Hamikdash, so we moved into Eicha. But
no, I don't mean this. I don't mean the tune. No. What I mean is just like what I'm talking about is the following. You have the Megillah is broken up into psukim, correct?
Oh.
Whatever trup is used for the Megillah, typically includes a sof pasuk. You can always tell the end of the pasuk.
True.
Right? What the Gaonim here, some of them said, was they didn't want to do that in the Megillah. Even though in Kriyas Torah and Haftorah, we always signify the end of a pasuk with a sof pasuk, correct? When it comes to the Megillah, they wanted to run one pasuk into the next pasuk, which is peculiar, right? Let's say, we'll take any pasuk, right, in the Megillah. So, 1 second. Instead of Vayhi b'mei Achashverosh hu Achashverosh hamalech mehodo ad kush sheva v'yasrim me'ah medina, and pausing sheva how does it go? Sheva v'yasrim me'ah medina, right?
Right.
What they would do is they'd say sheva v'yasrim me'ah medina bayamim hahem. Meaning they wouldn't, which is the two words at the beginning of the next pasuk. They would try to, instead of pausing at the end of the pasuk or signifying the pause by the musical notes, right? Like a sof pasuk, a tipcha, sof pasuk, etc. What they would do is they would intentionally run the end of the pasuk into the next pasuk. Very peculiar, right?
Very much. Yeah.
Why would they do that?
Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you, Rabbi Roth. Yes.
I think that is there any analogy between this practice or the division in practice, whether you end it with the pasuk or you don't end the pasuk, in the Aseres Hadibros, there are two ways of reading it.
Oh, that's such an interesting idea. But there you have, at least it's broken up in terms of dibros, tam elyon and tam tachton.
Right.
So first of all,
the way I understand that distinction is that you can read it the Aseres Hadibros in two ways.
Right.
One is you're studying the Torah and you need the end of the pasuk, and the other is
dibros,
speaking the Aseres Hadibros people as one event, one act.
Right. It's a great analogy. I
But
think it's
Rabbi,
something
on
to
the
think
other
about.
hand, if we have to go
But
right
there's a
away,
third one. There's a third possibility. I mean, what we do is Tam Elyon and Tam Tachton, right? Tam Elyon is Dibros, Tam Tachton is Psukim in the Sersa Dibros. But the Chazal say that based on the introductory pasuk of the Aseres Hadibros, that the Ribono Shel Olam said all of the Aseres Hadibros bivasachas. As kol advarim ha'ela. So the Chazal Rashi quotes it. Masha'ein, ha ozen yachal lishmoa, and masha'ein apeh yachal ladaber. What was the point? So that I think is comparable to this in a way. So I think it's a great analogy. I hadn't thought of it previously, but I thank you for that. That's great. I'll explain why I think it is so in a minute. So, but it's strange practice. Amnam b'shem Rab Tzemach Gaon Matzasi sheyifsok b'chol makom sheyirtze. Right? The heicha de gila lam b'Talmud lomar b'neshima achaz gila. Heicha de lo gila. Rab Tzemach Gaon said, "What is this? It doesn't come from the Gemara. You can't just make up things. If the Gemara wants to tell you to do something b'neshima achas, they'll tell you." They didn't say it here. And then the Kagos Mamunias goes further. He said, and by the way, in the Megillah, they do tell you in Aseres B'nai Haman to do that. But they're not just doing the whole.
that is in one neshima, that's of course.
Right, Neshimachas. You do, the Aseret, they do all the names of Haman. The Korea Megillah has to be very skilled to get it all.
You take a deep breath and you go. But
right.
Rabbi,
So obviously the rest is not. So he said, I don't understand the whole idea. But let me add one other point. I'm sorry, Kazan will ask a question first.
okay.
Then I'll get to
Very quickly. If you do not end the pasuk according to Mande Amar properly, and you go immediately into the next pasuk, it changes the whole meaning of the psukim.
Right, you have to be careful about it for sure.
So how do you do it?
So I'm going to explain in a second. So obviously you have to do it in a very, in a way that doesn't change the meaning, because you're right. I'll give you another example about the change in the meaning. Then I'll tell you one other interesting argument. The Rambam, the Yerushalmi says, Hakore, and the Rambam Paskins, Hakore Samagila V'to B'kriyasa. This is very similar to what you just asked me. If a person's reading the Megillah and you see, he pronounces some of the words imprecisely. The Kara Kriya Mishubeshes. And he reads it in a sloppy way. Baruch Hashem, the Baalei Kriya that we know, you usually are very meduya. I know you're telling me that Ezra reads for you. I'm sure it's
superb. He's absolutely superb.
Yeah.
It's a good thing we're recording this.
Oh, okay. Well, I already said it, so it's too late.
No, I meant for the Chazan.
No, I'm joking. But the shul that I davened in,
Eitan's great also.
unfortunately, the person who read the Megillah, it was niftar a couple of years ago, but his superb. It was every word came alive. But what happens if somebody doesn't have that skill? So the Rambam has a very interesting halacha. It's based on the Yerushalmi, that if you read the Megillah, v'korek kriya mishubeshes yatsa. Why? So in the Yerushalmi it says lefi she'ein medaktikin b'ta'useha, because we're not going to force you to reread if you make a mistake. First of all, the Hagos Mamunios points out. He says in the Sefer Torah we would.
Yeah. Right. So I was just
more
thinking
than that.
So
The Rambam doesn't
is
say
the
that.
Megillah,
Listen to
is
the
the
language
Megillah
of the
less
Rambam.
important? Is the Megillah less important than the Sefer Torah?
So obviously we're more mekel here, but then the Rambam adds she'ein medaktikin b'kriyasa, which is interesting because the Yerushalmi's language is ein medaktikin b'ta'u yoseha. With the Rambam, it sounds like almost like it's no big deal. We're not medaktik in the kriya. The kriya doesn't need diktuk. Why not? So let me give you one other example, and then I'm going to tell you what I think all this is about. The Maram Mintz wrote a letter to the Trumas Hadesha. Is Ashkenaz. This is like, my father, Zecharna Levracha's field, 15th century Ashkenaz, 14th, 15th century Ashkenaz. So the Maram Mintz wrote a letter to the Trumas Hadeshen, the great authority of Ashkenaz, one of the great authorities, who's quoted all the time in the Shulchan Aruch. And he said to him, listen, in the in the literature, Agos Maimonios and others, one of the things they quote is that the Parshios in a Megillah should be stumin, not psuchin. I don't know if people are familiar. There's a difference. I mean, there are arguments exactly what this means, but broadly speaking, there are two types of parshios in the Sefer Torah. One is called an open parsha, and the other is called, or an introductory parsha, and the other is called a stumo. That's called psuchos. The other one is stumos. Stumos means it's
Closed.
Help me out. What's a good translation of stumos?
Closed? Doesn't the word mean
I mean,
closed?
closed, yeah. But the idea is as follows: like if you a parsha psucha begins at the beginning of a line, meaning the revach, the space between one parsha and the other, is all in the end of the previous line. In other words, the previous parsha ends. There's a space on that line, and then you start the new parsha on a new line. That's called a parsha psucha. A parsha stuma is when, on the contrary, the previous parsha ends, you leave some space, but on the same line, you start the new parsha. That's called a parsha stuma. So when it comes to a Megillah, the Gaonim said all the parshios are stumos. But the Maram Mintz wrote a letter to the Trumas Hadeshen. I must have been in event, something that took place. He said, listen, I know the Gaonim said that the parshios are all stumos, meaning they don't begin, new parshios don't begin on a new line. They always begin, after some space on the same line. He said, but, maybe that's not because of, of the connection to a Sefer Torah where it's ma'akev. You can't make a stuma into a psucha or psucha into a stuma in a Sefer Torah. Maybe it's because it's an igeres, and an igeres, you don't typically have psuchos. All the ideas and all the themes are much closer together. So the Trumas Hadeshen wrote back to him. I actually have some of the language here. This is what he asked him. He said, here, Asher kasavta b'megillah sheyesh ba parshios psuchos ikshera ladas maram b'shem Rabbeinu Tam, etc. The yesh Megillah kol din Sefer Torah. The Sefer Torah imasa stuma psucha is possible. V'ratzisa lechalek shema maram Rabbeinu Tam l'rotz lo merak lechatchila mishum d'nikra igeres. Meaning the Maram Mintz was saying maybe the reason you need stumos isn't because of Sefer, but igeres, and then it wouldn't be ma'akev. So he got a very stern reply. He says, Tmihani alecha. He says, I'm shocked. Minayin lecha levados tame halachos milibcha. Who gave you the license to invent, new halachos? Ulefarish divrei agonim chutz mi mamashmos. The inu kaili sheyesh lekol din sefer Torah chutz midavar echad. They said that this is midin sefer Torah. Why are you speculating that maybe it's an aspect of igeres? The kaili nami hakte parsho sein stumos badayu. Mash b'pshitas the hachmil sanami isla din sefer Torah filu b'diavad. V'atot tefaresh de lav dafkahu. V'lo komer lechatchila denikra igeres. V'hach svar lo misratzis klal. The stumanami parsha nikra b'kula talmuda. He said, if you really think it's an igeres, there shouldn't even be a split difference. The parshios of stuma and psucha are they on the next line or on the same line? Kadeshite kamo igeres, kediisa, etc. Yesh nogim shlo lahafsik b'kriyasa ben pasuk lapasuk. The nikra igeres, like we just said, some people run one pasuk into the other. Amnam yesh mekilin. The Samche Amaidik Sibhaga, Maimunos to Enkol Din Sefer Torah Lemegillah, Mahida Osios Metushtashos, Mekuraos, Amnam Mahadran Medaktik in the mitzvos, Yeshlim Lakayim Div Rabbeinu Tam Maram. He says, I don't want to, I think this would be a totally unacceptable kula. So what's going on here? I'm going to tell you give you one other piece of the puzzle, and then we'll explain. The first halacha on the second parak of the Rambam which matches the second, the new parak, the second parak of Megillah, is the halacha of akores hamegillah lemafreya lo yatsa. If you read the Megillah out of order, let's say you read the whole Megillah, but you read it out of order. What does that mean? So you read the first pasuk, then you skipped to the third pasuk, then you went back to the second pasuk.
Well, let's say you do that with the parsha on Shabbos. Does that work?
No, but
So why should,
but it doesn't work in a Megillah either.
good.
But it seems like, and that's a great point that you just made, but the Gemara, that they don't derive that from the fact that it's a sefer.
I mean, first of all, why does it make any sense that you be Yotze? I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, you're
Well, you are reading, all the psukim.
yeah, but you're changing the order of the story.
Oh.
I mean, you
Correct,
take any.
correct. So let's say it made sense.
I mean, if you learn
For
a
example,
Gemara
I should add, by the way, because
you do the maskana, then the how. I mean, like anything in
Right.
life, it doesn't even make
Right.
sense.
So we're going to explain in 1 second. And both the Chazan and you are also raising a good point. But when I said before that, if you're Toa B'Kriya, and you read a Kriya Mishubeshes, Ein Medaktik and B'Kriyasa, I should add, the Rambam doesn't say this, but the Torah says that's only if it doesn't change the meaning. Like if you don't read perfectly, that isn't Ma'akev, but you can't read words that are the wrong words. Correct?
Okay.
But so the Turei Even basically says, even if the psukim lemafreya would make sense, right? There's still a problem of reading it lemafreya. Why? And then he asks an interesting question. He says, let's say you read, we said before that if you have most of the majority of the Megillah is not Meshubash in the sense, the text is proper and the text is there, then you could be fulfilled even if you have to read a little bit Balpeh. But when it comes to Kori Lamafreya, it seems like anything that you read Lamafreya is no good. Why is that? It doesn't say Rove. Obviously, there's a difference between reading orally and reading Lamafreya. And according to Turei Even, even if it would make sense. So what's going on? So I think the answer to all these questions is one simple answer. As we know, the story of Purim, doesn't have the name of Hashem in it, as we know, right? Tinted, it's a remez, Yavo HaMelech, the Haman Hayom, Yud Kei Vav Kei. More to the point, the theme of the Megillah is V'nafalchu. The theme of the Megillah is Hashgacha. It's divine providence. It's the idea that, there are the things that we experience and that we see in a very clear way, or, as we're experiencing them. And then there's, what happens, behind the veil, the hashgacha, the things that we don't know necessarily at the moment, but we find out about later when we connect the dots and we reconstruct. And, then we're blown away by, almost a completely different understanding of even things that have befallen us, never mind the Jewish people. The story of the Megillah, is the story of, Hashgacha Pratis. It's the story of the experience and the, visible events, and then there's the context and, all the machinations, the what could have beens, and all the coincidences. From that point of view, the story of the Megillah is maybe the most relevant, of all stories beyond Chamisha Kumshei Torah. That's what the Rambam, quoting the Yerushalmi, means when they say, based on the pasuk in the very end of the Megillah that we read, v'zichram lo yasuf mizaram, that what happened in the story of Purim and what is encapsulated in the Sefer / Igeres of Purim, of the Megillah, is unforgettable and omni-relevant. Because even more so in some respect than other stories and even other events, it underscores the principle of hashgacha, of divine providence, and the idea that, there's what we see, and then once we gain more knowledge, the appreciation that we have of what really happened, and the faith, that instills in us, about living a life of purpose, a life that is devoted to, to Torah and to mitzvahs. In that sense, the Megillah is both an igeres and a sefer. A sefer is something like a sefer Torah. Every word, every letter, even the crowns on the letters, the chasera, the spelling of the letters, of the words, the chaseros and yiseros. About a sefer, we say it's all shemoso shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? We consider, Ramban says that, Kishem Hashem ekra havu godel Elokeinu. Gemara says in Brachos and Daf Kaf Aleph that the Birchas HaTorah is based on this pasuk. When you learn Torah, it's like you're encountering, the Ribono Shel Olam's name, and you do that by, darshaning the pasuk, by being medayek b'osi oseh. There are no shibushim that are allowed in Sefer Torah. It has to be spelled perfectly. Everything has to be, written exactly the right way, the right psuchos, the right stumos. Of course, you can never run one pasuk into another. We're medayik, we darshan. That's what much of our learning is all about. It's about being medakdek. Why does it say it this way and not that way, and the extra word and the extra limud. And in our share previously, for those of you who are here, we're trying to figure out the relationship between Gittin and Kedushin. It's so complicated. V'yatsa v'haisa, the words, the kasa, the nasan. What we do in typically is we zero in. We're hypersensitive about every word, every letter, every order of everything. But sometimes we need to relate to things, in a broader way as an igeris. Instead of being, hyper focused on, each and every word, sometimes you have to stand back and, see a text not as a sefer, but as an igeris. Igeris has a connotation, an epistle, almost, when you read an igeris, you don't read it like this, you read it like this, you hold it from a distance. And as a result, sometimes ein medaktik in be'osi oseh, as long as the text and the words are the same, but the pronunciation or being medaktik initially, in every jot and tittle and spelling and the form of the letters and every word is less important than standing back and getting the bigger picture and the larger understanding. So what the Gemara says initially is that we have to treat the Megillah, in the order of things. The Megillah characterizes itself first and foremost as an igeris. Once you see it as an igeris and you treat it as an igeris, then you can go back and analyze it as a sefer. The first two references are igeris. Then it's nichta b'sefer. So the Gemara's application now makes a lot of sense. The Gemara says, listen, in order to bind the disparate, pieces of parchment together to make a whole, you can't do that with, pishtan, with chutim. For that, you need the gidin that you need for a Sefer Torah, meaning you have to integrate, the story, and you have to see it, in a rigorous way. However, you don't have to see it with a microscope initially. First, you have to see it in its broadest strokes and be impressed, by all the coincidences and all of you miss the coincidences if your nose, is too much in the book. You need the distance of the epistle in order to see, this is connected with, now I get the connection between what was before, what's after, what's going on here, what's going on there, the yin and the yang, the double screen, that's in front of you. So on the one hand, you need to attach, firmly the pieces to each other. At the same time, you don't need to have every inch, fastened with a gidin. It's enough to have 3 on the top, 3 in the middle, and 3 in the bottom, because the looseness initially of the connections actually enhances our appreciation of the coincidences the hashgacha and the interaction of the various parts. That's what the Gemara says. Then the Rambam takes a giant step, quoting the Rav Hai Gaon. Says, you know what? When you read the Megillah, you should also treat it like an Igeris. And how do you do that? By opening up the whole Megillah. Before you even start reading it, you open up the entire Megillah. I mean, you have to fold it a little bit. But what's the difference between having it all completely open like this, or at least in folds, but it's all open and accessible, as opposed to, you're turning the, like a Sefer Torah, you're being koreach, you're turning the pages as you're moving, because in one case you're reading microscopically and you're zeroing in only on the words and the text in front of you, and in the other you're reading the text, but the text is being read as part of a much bigger story. So I think that's the pshat of the minhag of the Gaonim. They said, well, we run from one, we don't even want to stop at the end of psukim. We want to show the interconnection between one pasuk and the other. Meaning, if you end with a regular sof pasuk, we do this anyway, but I'm just trying to explain the other view. They said that's safer type reading. But as long as it doesn't change the meaning, if somehow you can also kind of transition to the next pasuk, that's the greatness of an igeris. And then some of the Mefarshim, the Maramitz was saying, you know what? It's true that you need stumos and not psuchos. What's the difference between psuchos and stumos? It's the same idea of holding the whole thing open or having, the connections on the top and the middle and the bottom and not all the way through. It's the same thing as running one pasuk into the other, or separating each pasuk completely separately. Namely, what's the idea? Psuchos, kishma kenu, is a bigger break. That's why you start the next chapter or the next parsha on a new line. The idea of stumos is that even though you're making a break, but you're insisting on starting, the next parsha on the same line after the break that you terminated the previous parsha. I mean, you're highlighting the continuity between them. So in a way, right, all these minhagim, whether you follow them or not, some we do, some we don't, all these minhagim are about taking a step back, not looking at everything as a say microscopically, but looking at the, connecting the dots, if you will. So then Rabbi Roth's terrific suggestion, like the Seres HaDibros, you could read the Seres HaDibros and Psukim, but that's different than reading them as Dibros. And the Rabbanu Shalom, as Kol HaDvarim Ha'ela, he was able to integrate all the Dibros b'vas achas. We can't do that. For him, it's all the same. It's all Shmosav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But in that respect, let's come back to the other puzzle that we began with. I said, there are different views as to where you start the reading of this story. Right? Some people start, they say the whole story. That's our practice. That's our psak. But there are others who say, you start from the Jewish part. Mordechai HaYehudi. And others people say you start from the Tsaras. It's like different perspectives on, what do people zero in on, Jewish history, the anti-Semitism, what is it, the elephant and the Jewish question, where do you start? Maybe have Balaylahu Nada Shnas HaMelech, the Rabbanu Shalom's more obvious presence and hashgacha. But Reb Chelbo said something profound. He said, even if in the Kriya, you're going to start at some later point, and you're going to, zero in more on the action or on a certain motif, the entire Megillah has to be written in front of you. Why? For the same reason that the Gaonim wanted to be poshet the Igeres and run one pasuk into the next. Meaning, because the uniqueness of the Megillah and the story of the Megillah and the Nes of Purim is precisely that, interconnection, that idea of Hashgacha. So even if you don't read, about Achashverosh and Vashti, and the presence of Mordechai, and the story with big son Viseresh, and so on and so forth, because that isn't the main part. You could get the story, without it, but but it needs to be there, because there, when it is there, the context and the v'nafochu and the sense of hashgacha is all the more evident. And of course, we paskin for that reason that you have to say the whole thing. Nothing is superfluous, right? By the fact that he was molech mihodo v'yad kush, even the small little things are part of the story, because it's all one story. At the same time, ein medaktik the Rambam changes not just ein medaktik in b'tal yosel. The Rambam said, listen, it's always good to be medayik. And if we have a Baal Koreh, which Baruch Hashem we do, who has the skill and the knowledge and has invested effort and the respect and reverence that implies, that it's a different kriya samagila. And that's a very special thing. At the same time, the principle of ein medaktik in Biosio says, like how it's spelled in the first at first blush, how it's spelled is less important, than getting the story right. So the Rambam said, not only ein medaktik and b'tal yoseh, even when you're reading it, you should be medayik, but don't read it in a medayik way that detracts from appreciating the story and the interconnection of the story. Let it be a Megillah first, and then a Sefer. But let it be a Megillah as well. That's not a concession. That's why I think he says, ein medaktik and b'kriyaseh, meaning be medaktik, but don't be medaktik to be medaktik. Be medaktik to appreciate, this wider, stance. And that's why I think the first halakha that we have in when the Mishnayos and the Rambam discuss the Megillah is the din of ein korin l'mafreya. Meaning, even if it were to be true, and some of us would say, well, just like Jacob said, it doesn't make sense. If the words don't make sense, so what would the havamina? Even then, there would be a havamina, meaning you did the kriya, you said all the words, but obviously that's a hollow, kiyum. So let's assume that there's a way to be korei l'mafreya where it still would make sense. I mean, there are many stories. I don't know about you, but when I read a book sometimes, if it's not a serious book, if it's something that I want to skim and I want to get an impression of, I sometimes cheat, meaning I sometimes, read the middle before the beginning or the end before the middle, or, if I'm impatient and it's not something important, there's more than one way to read something. And even reading it out of order sometimes, has its charm. But when it comes to the Megillah, even if it would make sense, in the end of the day, you lose something by not reading it in order, because the whole point of the Megillah is the order. It's the v'nafochu. It's Balayla Shnas HaMelech. So that the particular dinim of the Megillah, and especially the interplay between, Igeris and Sefer, are really, part of the story of Hashgachas Hashem, divine. And the sweep, that bigger picture, holding that epistle, in front of us, before we then microscopically dissect it, as a sefer, really enhances, the experience. So for that reason, I think, in the order that the Megillah calls itself an Igeres, and then and only then, a sefer.
To become a sefer.
And the practices, which are debated, how much sefer, how much Igeres, are really about the balance, between these two elements. But both elements are critical, to what is unique about Purim. And that's why, just to conclude as we began, that's why the Yerushalmi says, and there's a parallel medrash which speaks not about the Megillah but about the observance of the holiday of Purim. This idea that even though it's a very strange phenomenon, as we know, I mean, it's a rabbinic holiday, not a biblical one. It's not Pesach, it's not Shavuos, it's not Sukkot. It's Purim. Like Hanukkah, it's Midivrei Sofrim.
The mitzvahs of the Yom are rabbinic also, the 4 mitzvahs of Purim?
Yeah, sure. But I'll say one thing about that since you made the comment. But certainly Mishloach Manos, Matanos Levyonim, the Kriyas HaMegillah, these mitzvos. I mean, the whole day is a mitzvah is Drabanan. However, there is a lot of evidence that you fulfill mitzvos Doraisa as well. For example, that when we say that the Kriyas HaMegillah Zuhi Hilula, that's a kind of a Hallel, or the very beginning of the Masachet, and of the Rambam's portrayal of it, Mivatlin Talmud Torah and Mivatlin Eswa Avoda, L'Kriyas HaMegillah. So this is something that triggered a lot of controversy in its time. Meaning, how could you be Mivatel Talmud Torah, which is Doraisa, biblical obligation? How could you be Mivatel the Avoda? Some people say it doesn't really mean Mivatel. It means postpone. It's like Dochen, not Mivatel. But there are those who think that it really means Mivatel. So how could you do that? It's only a rabbinic mitzvah. The answer is the obligation and the particular form is rabbinic, but it touches on themes. If the theme of the day is, Pirsume Nisa and Kiddush Hashem, and especially an appreciation, a cultivation of sensitivity to Hashkachas Hashem, those are biblical, not just biblical, they're foundational halachic and biblical principles. So while technically, the obligations here are rabbinic because this isn't in the Torah, it was enacted by the Chachamim at the behest of Esther and Mordechai. In the end of the day, it's a very unusual Rabbanan, which promulgates practices and themes that certainly are Doraisa. And for that reason, whether it's the Megillah or the holiday, the idea that together with Chamisha Chumshei Torah, these have everlasting significance, and they even outlast many things that are in the Torah itself. Zichram lo yasuf mizaram, that they are unforgettable and that they are eternally relevant, is something that becomes not just curious but really very very compelling. Okay, so I wish everybody.
Can you try? Can I just ask one question, Rabbi Rosensweig?
For sure.
Can you try to define in some precise way hashgacha?
Hashgacha means divine providence,
But
and the idea behind it is meaning the idea that while we may not be privy, and sensitive and aware, that there is a divine hand, in history. We don't see it, explicitly. That we have faith, that our fate and our destiny, is in the hands of a greater power, in the hands of the Ribono Shel Olam. And this Purim story with all of its with that which is I'd say glaringly missing an explicit divine role, but with one coincidence, v'nafochu, everything turning around, all the coincidences, the powerful imagery and the incredibly compelling formulations of both Mordechai and Esther. Umiodea im le'es kazos, higat l'malchus, you reach this high station, maybe this is the reason for it. Everything, balayla hu nadash nas hamelech,
yes,
that's not the king Achashverosh only, it also means the king, of the universe. So this idea of a higher purpose and a higher hand that guides, history and history of the Jewish people in particular, is what I mean by this, epistle or igeris, aspect. This idea of, instead of, living, or looking at things with tunnel vision. Sometimes that's very important for good analysis. You have to be rigorous and sometimes have, tunnel vision. But to appreciate, broader trends in the world, and in life, sometimes you have to look at things from a greater distance and, with less initial narrow scrutiny, so that eventually, you can apply, greater rigor, once you have an accurate understanding of, the past reconstruction. So then the ability then to dissect, the minutia, becomes ever more powerful. So that's the idea. If you want to follow up, and I'm happy to.
Thank you. It's too late now, but it's a very interesting concept with loads of implications.
Yeah. Sure.
Rabbi, may I just mention that after your outstanding explanation of the Nafochu, the whole idea of Emunah and everything clarifies in my mind the notion of Kimu veKiblu, not only of the Megillah, but Kimu, as we know, the tradition is that we have to be Mekayim the mitzvahs. Right. After there is a connection, according to what I feel, between Kimu veKiblu and the Nafochu.
Right. That's a great point. I think that's true.
Yeah.
This idea that, this perspective, because again, what Chazal say is that, at the time of Matan Torah, things were so heady that, kaf aleim har kigigis, that, there was whether it was, actual coercion or, the inability, to exercise, complete, free will. But the idea of kimu v'kiblu, kimu masha kiblu kvar, that this was accepting Purim and adding, what we call kiyumiv, fulfillments of biblical ideas, but in a rabbinic, form, but especially, recognizing again the sweep of providence, and sometimes, looking at events again, not microscopically, but in a broader way, all of this, was kind of a reaffirmation, but on a different basis, with a greater degree of volition of the destiny of Matan Torah. So I think that's a really good point. Thank you. And we'll continue Mirza Hashem in our regular share in 2 weeks from tonight.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
you so much.
Yes.
Thank you.